Okay, welcome to our gallery talk. My name is Mark Swain. I'm the Chair of Art and Design. We're not only celebrating Women's History Month, but we're also celebrating our current show, Women in Art at the Field. And I would like to welcome Rebecca Banasiak and Adrienne Stroup. Rebecca?
I'm Rebecca Banasiak. I work at the Field Museum. I'm also an alumnus of Lewis University. I graduated in 1997 with a bachelor's in fine art and in chemistry. I've been at the Field Museum since 2001, so I've been there. I had my 20th anniversary in January. I'm also what we call the prep lab manager in mammals. Also, full title is collections assistant, chief mammals preparator. And what that entails is skinning and stuffing mammals and any specimens that the researchers bring in. And the stuffing, what that entails with that is study skins. So with the illustrations that I do, I usually use the study skins as a reference for color and the facial structure and form. So having hands-on with the mammals that I work with at the museum is actually a benefit with all of the art that I do.
Very good. Adrian?
Yeah, my name is Adrienne Stroup. I work in the vertebrate paleontology collections at the Field Museum. I did my bachelor's. I'm from upstate New York, so I went to school there and then moved here after my master's. I did my bachelor's in geology, and then I went back for a master's in museum studies. So I always wanted to kind of combine art and science together, and working in a museum was my way of getting into paleontology with also doing art. So at the museum, I'm a collections assistant, and I work with the Vert Paleo collections. I'm ahead of their loan program, so I actually send fossils of all sorts of different fossils through the mail to researchers and different institutions around the world for their studies, if they can't come to the museum in person. So that's kind of what I do on a day-to-day basis, but my other passion is art, and so I try to combine both the art and the science together a lot in outreach programs. So a lot of drawing along with me, kind of YouTube videos I've done with the Learning Center, and that's pretty much it.
Very good. Well, welcome both of you. One of our purposes for doing our gallery talks obviously is to learn more about the artist and the art. And I encourage anybody watching to, if you can, come in person and view the show before it's down, or you could look at some samples online. There is a third artist who's in this show, Peggy McNamara, who is not with us during this interview, but again, I encourage you to see her work. It's really beautiful as well. So we can sort of go back and forth talking about our experiences or about your experiences with art and how they relate to your role at the museum. You could talk a little bit about your background and how you became interested in art, and perhaps some of the actual pieces in the show, which I know is going to be part of this gallery talk as well. So Rebecca, you mentioned that you use your illustrations and your drawing in particular to help study the animals. Can you expand on that a little bit more and kind of walk us through the process of how you do that?
So as the chief mammals preparator at the Field Museum, the nice thing about working with the collection is there's hands-on, so I'm able to not only prep the specimens, like I'm going to use an example, a red panda that I did recently in the past year. So before the pandemic hit, I skinned a red panda and took multiple photographs of the skin before I actually took it off of that carcass in the body, so that I had an ample amount of reference photos to do any kind of illustrations. Because it's very, the only other aspect of us being able to see the animals is going to, say, like a zoo or a nature preserve or a wildlife center. But you don't actually get hands-on, hands-on. You don't actually get to, feel like how heavy is the animal or how soft is the fur. So I'm able to not only take the reference photos for later on, but I can also take measurements, which then, when you're doing an illustration, a lot of times you want to make sure that everything is accurate. You want to make sure, the mammals are proportionate. Head to body, limbs, and then just within the face, the facial structure, eyes, nose, mouth, where everything, lands on the page will, actually translate to the audience. Oh, this is then, this particular animal. We know what it looks like. So having that hands-on benefit, really helps me. So I can also then, knowing, like the texture of the fur, I can then translate that, and depending on what media I'm working with, I can then, adjust what tools I'm going to use. If I'm using watercolor or ink or pastel, I can change up, whatever tools or brushes or, different techniques. So that truly is the benefit that I have for working, hands-on with the mammals. When I get to the stuffing part, I tend to use my art background as well, because now what I get to do is I do the taxidermy part of my job. I don't necessarily create anything as a mount because we don't have the room to put multiple mounts, specimens within our cases. So we do what's called a study skin. And the study skin, it's just a straight, I guess, elongated flat skin, and it's stuffed with cotton. But what I usually do is, with a lot of the mammals that we don't have a lot of specimens of, I sculpt the face so that down the line I can go back to that specimen and at least use the head structure as reference, in-person reference, not just using my photographs, in-person reference, so that I can get the rest of the fur and facial structure. I don't want to call it humanizing the animal, but basically humanizing my, my subject matter. So that is, that's using, that particular animal as an example. So I could do that with a lot of the smaller animals, like the pangolin and honey badger, and there's a couple others, red foxes. I can do that with those size animals, but the larger animals, I tend to have to go down to the exhibit halls where the mounts are at. So something like a ram or an ox. We don't have, the only specimens that I'm able to actually go to within the collection are just skulls. Okay. So, that's the great thing actually about having the museum, is we have an extensive, mounts that are on exhibit as well that I'm able to use. So, yeah.
Very good, thank you. Adrian, what about you? Could you touch on a little bit, and you did in your introduction, but the kind of connection or correlation between your art and maybe even your background in art, and how you connect that back to your work at the field? And is your inspiration purely scientific, or is there more of a personal, expressive kind of element to it?
Yeah, kind of touching on what Rebecca said, all I have to work with are the skulls and the skeletons of the specimens, which is, it makes it a little more challenging, but to jump back a little bit as well, my background in art started really young, as well as my love for paleontology and dinosaurs and all the extinct animals that are no longer around. And just drawing them was just a passion, and I started taking art lessons with my mom and her teacher when I was 8 years old. And it's never stopped. And so being able to work with the museum collection has been a huge inspiration. And it's just, I've learned so much just from working at the museum and actually working with the fossils and talking to other scientists about their work and learning anatomy better. So it's definitely influenced my work in that way. And also, from the flip side, I think that being an artist has helped me in getting a job at the Field Museum, because my boss, who used to be the vertebrate paleontology, he's the collections manager, but he started off as a preparator. And so one of the skills you need is to be good with your hands and to be very hand-eye coordinated. And so I mentioned, well, I am an artist and I'm very detail-oriented in that way. And so I think those skills go hand in hand. And what I'm always trying to teach people when I'm doing outreach is that art and science go together really well. And it's definitely something that people often like to disconnect, but I'm always trying to bring those two back together. Like, no, you need both in order to like succeed. If you want to be a better anatomist or a paleontologist or anybody doing any kind of biological sciences, you also need the visual skills that an artist may have, and just sketching out things makes it so much easier to comprehend. Like, I often see researchers coming in to the museum just to sketch the bones that they're working on, and it just helps solidify that. Looking at the processes and drawing it out makes it more of a learning experience than just taking photographs.
Yeah, your stories are make a case to turn STEM into STEAM.
Yeah.
You've probably heard that before.
Yes, STEAM is one of the I guess proponents. Or what would you call it? Yeah, proponents.
Yeah.
That every single time that I am asked to do something, like an outreach program with the museum, I constantly always bring art into it, because having both degrees in science and art, for me, that's actually what helped me get a job at the museum. It wasn't, I wasn't hired just for my art. I also had that science background that the museum, my old boss, Bill Stanley, who passed away in 2015, he actually was the person who hired me. And when I was interviewing for the internship through the Art Institute, he had asked Peggy McNamara, who was my teacher at the time, how is this girl? Should I hire her? She has this science degree, but she hasn't, graduated with her BFA yet from the Art Institute. What do you think? And Peggy was very blunt and said, she comes to class every day, hire her. Yeah. So he basically, when he had interviewed me, he said, I love the fact that you have a science degree, because you will understand then what we're doing, and why we're doing it. But this is the reason why I need you in the mammal division, is for your art. I need you to do, Photoshop work and some illustrations and this type of stuff. But I will also need you to do science, and knowing that you have a science degree, you're not going to squirm and all this when you see skinning something or something like that, which I went hands in, no problems. So every single time now that I work with the education department, every single Meet the Scientist, or it's now I think called Meet and Field Insider, I think is what it's called now. Which I have one coming up. I'm always talking about STEAM, because STEM is just, people don't realize that in order for your brain basically to work back and forth, it's both, it's both sides, So that's the thing. So art is one side and all the science is the other side. So, they work hand in hand. And, I see researchers as well, not recently with the pandemic, but before it happened, we would have researchers coming in all the time, and they would always have that assistant with them who, say, had, a bachelor's in mammalogy or biology or zoology, and they would be the one that would be sitting there with the bones drawing them. Or sitting there with the skin, doing, details on, say, the feet and the hands of the mammals. So, having that, it's that correlation between the two that really, it would be like every single day I would come in, it would be there. And in my job now, I have to have, some kind of, there's always some art that's involved, because when I'm stuffing something, I have to use my sculpting skills. So, right there is, that's part of it.
So for folks coming in, if you get a chance to come in and see this, or even online, it's true that you should expect to see specimen illustrations. But because it's 3 different artists with 3 different styles, really, or approaches to art, would the two of you like to comment a little bit on how you approach it from an artistic standpoint? What sort of parameters do you have to stay in? For the average person walking through and looking at the show, why do they appear to be different? Different styles and different approaches to art, and what amount of personal expression can you bring to the work? Say, for example, Adrian has some specimen illustrations, but then also has some pieces that show the background and the space, as I said before, whereas Peggy's will show some specimens, but they're also kind of like abstract overlays or architectural overlays. A couple of her illustrations actually have what appear to be the interior of the museum and some of the various rooms they use, showing specific specimens. So there's a different sort of a perception and approach in all 3 of your works, and where are you getting that from? Where are you drawing that from? Let's start with maybe Adrian.
Okay. So I like to focus on the subject first, but then also, especially with my paleontology work, like paleo art is what it's called, I try to make everything in the scene as accurate as possible based on the time that I'm working on. So you'll see a bunch of different works that I've done from different geological time periods. And so, like with the Eocene, I try to bring in other animals that lived alongside each other, as well as the plants, and kind of give a hint to the terrain or the different climate. And so I've done that for a couple of them. I've tried to get away from just showing one animal by itself, but to actually put it back into its original context with its environment. And so I try to make more of a scene than just focusing on one animal. And that comes from my art background of just like making more of a composition, drawing in a lot of different elements of like the sky and the terrain and the scale between animals, and just to get a more lifelike view of what that time period looked like.
Very good. And Rebecca, with your approach on some of your illustrations, some of your pieces of art, say, for example, I think it's a Mexican wolf.
Mexican gray wolf, yeah.
Mexican gray wolf.
Yeah.
So that one in particular, but then there are others too, and also this is true, I think, with Peggy's work, where there are, you have creative license, so that you're not just purely, and I know this is true with you, Adrian, as well, but you're not just purely illustrating. You're not just, your goal is perhaps to illustrate the animal, but you're also getting into the, you can tell with the fur of the Mexican gray wolf that you are into the act of making the, I believe that's a paint marker, is it, or?
It's ink, so it's acrylic ink. So I did use some paint markers, but I actually when I work with ink, I actually like to work with using a brush. Or lately, what I've actually been doing on my black and white illustrations is going old school and using a nib and a handle.
Mm-hmm.
So the old school, pen. So, dipping it in the ink and then drawing it out that way, and discovering what I used to do. I used to play around with that, back in high school, and I figure, okay, I'm gonna 20 something odd years later, get back into it. But so like the Mexican gray wolf, I painted that with acrylic ink. It was just a different medium. And the one thing that, what was nice is that actually was one of the Mexican gray wolves from Brookfield Zoo. But we have a plethora of wolf specimens at the museum, which is wonderful. And we have we have not all the different subspecies, but we have a nice variety of the different subspecies of gray wolf. So I could go up into our collection and I can actually go to where we keep all of the flat skins and, look up, which ones are Mexican gray wolves, and actually, pull them down, because they're in a like a refrigerator, I guess you can call it, and they're hanging up because they're tan skins, and I can take them down, and I can actually feel how soft the fur is. So wolves, how coarse they look is very, very soft. I can then see the structure of, the type of fur that's on the face versus what's on the collar, what's on the back and the scruff and the tail. And I can, I then go ahead and I use different types of brushes to translate, what the fur would be on. Well, in this case, that's a board versus, on canvas.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Adrian, I noticed your work is relatively small in scale, whereas if you come to the show, Peggy's work, out of the three artists, Peggy's is definitely larger scale, and it could just be the pieces that are here. But Adrian, is it more of an intimate kind of approach to your art making? Do you like working, your work is very detailed, heavily detailed, so you like working in that small scale, mostly watercolor?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I tend to work on smaller forms just because I do enjoy the detail. If I end up doing something really large, then it's easier to lose track of the size and the scale of everything. So I tend to keep everything small so I can keep track of the scale, basically. And I do love all the detail that you can add to. And recently I've been doing more digital work, so I'll often start with something small and then I'll scan it, and then I will do it in Photoshop and make it whatever size it needs to be, but I like to start off small. Yeah.
Which brings me to my next kind of question is the future. So hopefully this show sort of gives you a little more inspiration, and you want to do another one in a few years. You started to touch on it, Adrian. What's the future hold for your art, and kind of where are you going to take it as far as subject matter? Or you just talked briefly a little about the form it'll take, but
Yeah.
anything else you want to add to your future aspirations for your artwork?
Yeah, I've gotten really into doing, a lot of my pieces are actually from commissions from work to do press releases for new scientific discoveries. And that's been a lot of fun. I'm hoping to do more of that. I'm actually working on one right now with a colleague that I used to work with at the museum, and he's publishing a paper about rabbits and ungulates, which are hoofed mammals, and their body mass size and the evolution of those two types of animals in relationship to each other. And it gets really complicated, but it's been a lot of fun. So I've been doing small sketches and then scanning the sketches in and then doing them in Photoshop on the computer with a tablet. And it's been really fun to actually paint with Photoshop, which is something I've been learning for the past couple years, because that's kind of the wave of paleo art, is to do a lot of digital work, because it does make it's trickier for me because it's something I'm learning now, but it's also really useful when you're working with a scientist. And often the pieces I do are very much between me as the artist and the scientist who's writing the paper, and we'll go back and forth and just kind of talk about what needs to be depicted in the picture, and like specifically what anatomy is important to show in the piece, as well as like what the paper might be about overall. And so it might be more of a, instead of one animal, it'd be like a ecosystem or a food web or something like that. So I've been doing a lot of those, and I'm kind of excited to do that more in the future. It's a lot more editable if you're doing it on the computer, and so that's kind of why that's become a more popular choice.
Right. I'm curious. You mentioned that you really only have the bones, and then now you said you're working on research with a scientist. Because we are inundated with images because of the internet, and you can do a Google search or whatever, do you ever find yourself looking at other illustrations or illustrators, or are there situations perhaps where that particular dinosaur hasn't never been really drawn, or, you know?
Yeah, that's absolutely, like, all of those things are true. So for one of the pieces that are in the show, which I'll probably talk about later, a lot of the background research I did was to read the paper by the author, and the author sent me a bunch of images that he found from other artists, just as like an idea, like just brainstorming, and not to copy anything, but to use that as like a reference, like this is kind of what this will look like, but this is a new discovery, so there's nothing else related to it that we have better specimens of. And so you kind of have to use everything that you can find. Just I also look at stuff on the internet and other images just to not copy something that, like composition-wise, to try to avoid that and make it more unique. But it is also a nice resource.
That's great.
Yeah.
It's challenging.
Yeah.
Rebecca, you touched on the liquid ink, but what other kind of future aspirations from an art standpoint you see yourself doing in the next year or 2 or 5 years?
I do work hand in hand with a couple of the researchers at the museum. So I do, a lot of times I'll do pen and ink illustrations for them whenever they're discovering new species. However, when I'm doing that, I have the specimen that's right in front of me. So I usually can work directly from the specimen that they collected, which ends up being a new species that they describe. So pretty much they do utilize me in that way. They'll contract me out to do that sort of work. So I still have, with all the discoveries that the researchers are constantly doing. There's one particular researcher that I do work a lot with. They're finding rodents and shrews all the time, which are little tiny, mammals, which are, easy for me to, draw something. And the techniques that I use, they're pretty old school, and but them being old school, they're usually the best method to translate what a researcher is trying to describe, with specific details. Mm-hmm. So that type of work doesn't necessarily dry up, in the zoology mammal sector. Right. So, I'll probably continue working with, the researchers in the future. I would love to take some taxidermy classes in order to do more mounts. which would be wonderful, so that I can, kind of extend the sculpting aspect of the study skins, into doing, more mounts. But with, my paintings, I tend to be more, scientific illustration oriented. So, I do tend to enjoy just, taking specimens from the museum and just, working on particular specimens on my own time. That pretty much is, I guess, how, I'll continue with my art. The one thing that I would like to do, like in this case with this show, is, hopefully, opening the eyes of the audience that, we do have women scientists in this case who are also artists as well. And, having it be showcased throughout Women's History Month, that was, kind of the goal, to, highlight basically women in art and science. The museum, and I will, throw kudos to the Field Museum. They've actually been, doing this now for the past, I think 5 or 6 years, where they highlight scientists, and a couple of years ago they started highlighting artists as well. So, the idea to, pull and create a show to, showcase, the scientists that are artists, just kind of fell out of, that aspect of it. The Field Museum, of course, doesn't have any affiliation with the show. It just happens that the three of us work at the Field Museum. That's really the only connection. But, I do give kudos to, my employer, because they do highlight as many females, especially during these past 5 years, as much as they can, even outside of Women's History Month. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, and thank you both. Please extend our thank you to Peggy next time you talk to her. I do know that several classes, faculty and classes and students, as a matter of fact, our provost and president just came through here today, and everybody really appreciates the show and loves the show, and it's great that it's happening during Women's History Month. Yeah. So we look forward to that future work that you do, and who knows, maybe we'll be sitting here in 2, 3, 4 years with a brand new show from all of you. So much thank you from me and from Natalie Swain, the gallery coordinator, and thanks for coming out and sharing your work, and it was nice to hear the stories behind the work. So thank you very much, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. So this is a piece that I touched on earlier in our conversation, and this is a press release image that I did for the Field Museum. One of our postdocs discovered a new Archosaur, so not a dinosaur, but a reptile from Antarctica. And we only have a couple of vertebrae and a really nice back foot, and so that's why we wanted to make sure that that part of the anatomy was highlighted in this image. And since we don't have a ton about like what the animal looked like, we had to go back and look at its relatives to see what it probably looked like based on other things that are in its family tree. So it's kind of iguana-sized and smaller than these other animals, and so I put him in the foreground more just to highlight him, but also to talk about the environment at the time. This is Antarctica, but it was a lush forest, and the braided stream here was a very common thing, and we could tell a lot about the environment from the fossils and the rocks that the fossils are found in. So everything is based on the evidence that is found and written about in this scientific paper that came out a couple years ago, but just to make it a little more approachable to general audience is where the art comes into it. So I like to kind of just make it a watercolor and make it a real natural looking scene, and it kind of touches on my background in doing modern animals and making sure that people realize that these ancient animals were animals like today as well. So make it look like a watercolor of animals that would be around today, but these actually lived in the Triassic. So back when Antarctica was lush forest. So this is a kind of a sentimental piece that I did for my friend who I worked with at the Field Museum for the first couple of years at my job. And he was a researcher that ended up going on to bigger and better things. But he's a mammal specialist in the Eocene. So the Eocene is about 50 million years ago, and he studies small carnivores that led to dogs and cats. So I wanted to, when he left, I made this piece for him as a gift. So this is a scan and a copy of the original. But I wanted to highlight some of the animals that lived during the Eocene, and our job was to unpack all of these fossils that were collected in the 50s through the 90s by Bill Turnbull. And he was a curator at the Field Museum. He was a paleomammalogist, a paleontologist, studies ancient mammals. And he collected so much that there was a huge backlog of these fossils. And so it was 2015 and 2014 when we started working on some of the backlog of these fossils that were collected but never unpacked and never cataloged and made ready for science. So me and Susumu Tomiya, we worked together on this for a couple of years, and I wanted to kind of make something for a going away present, basically, and this is what I came up with. So this is a drawing of Bill Turnbull working in Wyoming where these fossils were found, and it grades down to what the Eocene in Wyoming looked like 52 million years ago. So it's just kind of an homage to the project we worked on and to Bill Turnbull's work and Susumu's work, and it was a really fun piece to work on.
Okay, so the first piece that I want to talk about, this is Temnick's ground pangolin, and it's what would be considered a traditional scientific illustration using pen and ink and the stippling process. And I actually created it specifically for World Pangolin Day, which falls around February 19th, 20th, 21st of each year, the third Saturday of the month. This was done back in 2019, and back in the Field Museum, once I had it finished, we did a huge Meet the Scientist where we had pangolin specimens out, and I actually blew up the line drawing of the illustration and had the visitors come in, and they actually did the stippling process on a poster. So I had this illustration there as reference for them to look at, but then we also taught them how the process of stippling is done. And it's a traditional form that I kind of kept up with the past 20 years, and it's a very therapeutic for me as well, because all you're doing is creating dots, but those dots create all the nooks and crannies for the shadows and the highlights. So for me, keeping the traditional part of scientific illustration really does benefit my work in a way as a traditional scientific illustrator, but it also creates more of, how you would say, I just trying to keep that tradition alive, because a lot of scientific illustrators are going digital, and in order, whenever I'm teaching illustration, I always, tell any kind of student that, when you're doing something, you do have to learn the traditional arts first and before you go into the digital, because you need to know the form, and stippling really does help with that, because you actually can control a little bit more of where the shadows and the highlights are depending on how many dots you're putting down. But yeah, so it's actually one of my favorite pieces because it was specifically done for a particular purpose, both a Meet the Scientist at the Field Museum, but also for World Pangolin Day. So the next, it's actually a group. It's 4 pictures that are together. Normally, what I do is I do sketch out drawings before I go through and I do a final image. But in this case, these actually were done in my sketchbook, but I did more of a mixed media approach using colored pencil, ink, and watercolor. But the advantage that I had was, in this case, we have a Pyrrhexia, very hard to say, a northern cardinal, black-headed grosbeak, and a rose-breasted grosbeak. So all 4 of them, we have mounts at the museum. So each one I drew from the mount. But what I did was I used our bird collection as reference. So the flat skins that I normally create in the mammals division, we also have in the bird division. They do the exact same thing. So working in the collections, it's actually a benefit. So I was able to use, I'll talk about the rose-breasted grosbeak. I actually had male and female grosbeaks in front of me so that I can look at the different pelage and then actually create the colors on the page. So that way, even though it's a sketch that came from my sketchbook, this now becomes, a reference if I do decide to make something a little larger or something that has a scene in it. So using the collection has been a benefit. When we go back to and I'm gonna say this incorrectly again, the Pyrrhexia. This is actually, they're all cardinal type species as well. This is a specimen where I was able to see both gray, from full gray pelage all the way to gray and red. So I was able to pick out what I wanted to use as my reference for this picture. So, I'm very happy with the fact that I have, I'm able to utilize the collection at the Field Museum, both within the mammals collection and then also my colleagues and birds help me out. Usually they'll get some specimens out for me when I'm doing any kind of bird specimens. But yeah, so just anytime it's just in this case I call them simple sketches because they don't take me that long to do. But they'll end up being referenced just like the photos that I have that I take whenever possible, and then the reference of having the specimens at hand.